So we have the honor now to have our first keynote speaker, Dr. Jason Hickel. Jason, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and thank you all for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I look forward to the discussions that unfold. So I have a few slides to show, which I'll show about halfway through, so give me a moment to share my screen when that time comes. But let me just begin with a few opening remarks. So I'm going to use my time to make a few observations about the Nordic model and reflect specifically on what might be required of Scandinavian countries in terms of economic and ecological policy if they're to recover and retain their position of leadership into the 21st century. So let me start, of course, with the obvious, and that's that we all know what's good about the Nordic model. Excellent universal public services, relatively low levels of inequality, robust labor rights, progressive gender policies, a strong sense of social solidarity, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I don't need to dwell on that. So it comes as no surprise, of course, that, that Nordic countries tend to rank toward the top of most indicators of human development, right? And there's a lot to celebrate about this, and Nordic countries have long been regarded as a model for the rest of the world to follow. Although, of course, we know that social democracy has been increasingly under attack in Scandinavia, and none of these progressive values can be taken for granted going forward. So let's hope to defend them. But there's also a darker side to the Nordic model that we have to keep in mind, and it has to do with their ecological impacts. Now, this might seem a bit odd, as we're accustomed to thinking of Nordic countries as leaders in sustainability. After all, their air is crisp and fresh, their parks are free of litter, much of the region is covered in beautiful forests, and Scandinavians tend to be, for the most part, quite environmentally conscientious. But ecological economists, unfortunately, have a quite different story to tell. The problem with the conventional metrics of sustainability that we've used to assess the Nordic countries, but also all other countries, is that they do not account for the ecological impacts embodied in consumption that is imported from abroad, okay? In other words, they don't take account of international trade. So this means all of the resources and carbon that's involved in extracting and producing and transporting the material stuff that we consume, including the upstream inputs that are required for our own industrial production, okay? So, and of course, as I'm sure you all know, over the past 4 decades, high-income nations, including Scandinavian countries, have offshored most of this activity to poorer countries. And therefore, the material and carbon impacts of Scandinavian consumption have been shifted off of their books. And when we bring that impact back into view, when we take account of international trade, this is where things begin to go quite wrong. And I'm just going to show you my screen here to illustrate. It says that the host has disabled attendee screen sharing. So I'll need to have permission before I can do that, I think.
One moment, please. I will give you the permission.
No problem.
So I thought that you were already have a permission.
No problem.
So
I see I have the ability now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I will give the other speakers also now.
Great. So let's start with the question of CO2 emissions. So Nordic countries have among the highest consumption-based CO2 emissions in the world. It's significantly worse than the rest of Europe, than the European average. And it's only marginally better than the world's most egregious offenders, such as the USA, Australia, Canada, and Saudi Arabia. And this might seem surprising to us, given the reputation the Nordic countries have. But here we are. And it's interesting because, of course, some of the Nordic countries have very high levels of renewable energy capacity in terms of share of total domestic energy demand. But these gains in domestic renewable energy have been effectively wiped out by consumption-based emissions, okay? And this is a net emissions metric that accounts for emissions embodied in imports and also subtracts emissions embodied in exports, okay? So this is what it looks like compared to the world average. The world average consumption-based CO2 emissions data shows about 4.5, 4.8 tons per capita. And what we see is that the Nordic countries are significantly in excess of the world average, with Norway among the worst, which is surprising given that Norway's renewable energy share in domestic energy consumption, in domestic electricity generation is about 98%. It's very high. Now, crucially, climate breakdown is not the only crisis that we face. And of course, it gets most of the attention in our media, and for very good reason. It's obviously an existential threat. But there's a number of other crucial environmental crises that ecologists draw our attention to, which they consider to be at least as serious, if not in some cases more, than climate breakdown itself. And those include everything from deforestation, which we've been watching this happen before our very eyes in the Amazon and Indonesia recently. Soil depletion, UN scientists have pointed out that about 40% of the Earth's topsoils are depleted. And on our present trajectory of soil depletion, due primarily to intensive industrial agricultural practices, we have about 60 years of harvests left. Habitat destruction, which has been leading to very high levels of species extinction, which are now 100 to 1,000 times faster than prior to the Industrial Revolution, and chemical loading due to phosphorus and nitrogen runoff from intensive industrial agriculture. Okay, so one of the ways that scientists have communicated all of these impacts together in a single frame is with the planetary boundaries framework. And I'm sure this is familiar to many of you. It's probably the most important single innovation in ecological science over the past few decades. What it shows is where we are at in terms of human impacts on crucial Earth system processes, vis-a-vis what we consider to be safe thresholds or planetary boundaries. So this line here, just above the green, is the planetary boundary. And what you can see is that in places where we're in the yellow, we've overshot the planetary boundary. And in places where we're in the red, we're in a zone of extreme pressure and uncertainty at risk of triggering potentially irreversible tipping points. So what this makes clear is that it's not just climate change where we're facing problems. Of course, we've crossed the planetary boundary there, which was 350 parts per million. And we're in the danger zone, obviously, but it's true also of biosphere integrity, specifically genetic diversity, biogeochemical flows like phosphorus and nitrogen, like I mentioned, land system change, which is primarily deforestation and conversion to industrial agriculture. So one of the ways that we think about that we can measure nations' contributions to this broader picture of ecological impact is with a metric known as global material footprint, or material footprint, right? Material footprint is again a consumption-based indicator that takes account of trade and looks at the weight of all the material stuff that's extracted and produced and consumed in the economy every year. And what we can see is that there's been a really dramatic and quite alarming rise in material extraction and consumption over the past few decades. This red line here is 50 billion tons, and this is what ecologists consider to be a safe upper limit in terms of global resource use. And that's an upper limit. I mean, they suggest significantly less than that is more compatible with sustainable ecosystems. What we can see is that global resource use overshot that boundary in the late 1990s, and today we're actually getting pretty close to about 100 billion tons of stuff per year. It's been accelerating dramatically in the 21st century, not reducing. So there has been no there's been no decoupling or dematerialization of our economy, and we can see this this pattern plotted against GDP. We see a very close relationship between GDP growth and material throughput. There's been no decoupling between the two. There was some relative decoupling in the 1990s, but in the 21st century, there's been actually a rematerialization, a re-intensification of the economy in terms of material use. And this is despite a dramatic shift towards services and towards IT and so on, which has not yielded the benefits that we expected it would. We can discuss why that might be later on. Now, crucially, this problem is not being caused by everyone equally. It's being caused primarily, in fact, almost entirely by excess consumption in high-income nations. And we can see that when we plot material footprints or raw material consumption, which is the other way we refer to this metric, by country income group. What we see is that low-income countries are significantly below the per capita sustainable thresholds. at the region of about 2 or 3 tons per person per year. The same is true of lower middle income countries. Upper middle income countries exceed the threshold by a little bit. High income countries consume in the region of 28 material tons of stuff per person per year, which is roughly 4 times over the planetary boundary. And then what we see is something quite remarkable here, which is that the Nordic average is among the highest in the world. It ranks up there with the USA and Australia for extremely high levels of material extraction and consumption. If everyone was to consume like Nordic countries consume, we would be exceeding the planetary boundary by a factor of 5, roughly. So this is quite significant. So in fact, what we know is that if everyone consumed like everybody outside of high income nations, we would not be in a condition of resource extraction overshoot at all. We would be entirely within sustainable boundaries. So this is something to reflect on. And if we differentiate the countries, this is the image that we get, with Denmark on the lower end, a little bit below the high income average, and Norway again on the very high end, with this being the sustainable per capita boundary. Okay, so there's actually a number of other ways that we can look at this data. About a year or so ago, I developed the Sustainable Development Index in collaboration with some ecological economists who are colleagues of mine. What the Sustainable Development Index does is it starts with the Human Development Index and then corrects it for ecological impacts in consumption-based terms vis-a-vis overshoot of planetary boundaries, specifically CO2 emissions and material footprint, which are the 2 key indicators that we use in ecological economics. And what we see is that, unfortunately, Nordic countries perform among the very worst in the world. Of course, the obvious villains are the US, Canada, Australia. Here we have South Korea as well. A couple of European countries here, but the Nordic countries are among the worst in terms of their very low Sustainable Development Index scores. Okay. What's interesting also is that they have been worsening significantly over time. Back in 1990, the Nordic countries were actually among the leaders in sustainable development, and their score has depreciated significantly over the past few decades. And Sweden here is a really instructive example. It was one of the top performers in the Sustainable Development Index in 1990, in 7th position, and has in the past few decades sunk to position 143. Iceland is at position 155, Finland 156, Norway 158. There's only a few countries that are below them, including Saudi Arabia and the USA. So this is extremely concerning performance. Another way that we can see this is by looking at the broader planetary boundary framework. We've been developing the capacity to scale planetary boundary performance to nations. And this is just giving you 2 examples, Norway and Sweden. This line here, the second green circle, is the biophysical boundary according to the planetary boundaries framework. What we see is that Norway's use of phosphorus and nitrogen, and again, this is in consumption-based terms, is way off the charts in extreme overshoot to the boundary. So too CO2 emissions, material footprint, as I've just described. Ecological footprint is another indicator we use for ecological pressure, and land use change, which is one of the planetary boundary processes. Blue water extraction is pretty much the only area where it's clear that Nordic countries have not exceeded planetary boundaries. So here again, we see that the Nordic countries and high-income nations more broadly are overwhelmingly disproportionate contributors to global ecological breakdown. And this is crucially a question of justice. And the reason is because with these consumption-based indicators, what we can tell is that high-income nations rely on a significant net appropriation of embodied resources from the global south. So just to give you a sort of a sense of the regional breakdown, global north resource exports to the south, and this is global north as in Western Europe, the USA, Canada, Australia, and Japan, amounted to about 5 billion, amounts every year to about 5 billion tons, okay? Southern resource exports to the north, in other words, how much the north brings in from the south, is about 15 billion tons per year. So what this means is that there's a net resource appropriation from the south of about 10 billion tons. So a significant portion of the excess consumption in global north nations is net appropriated from the global south. And that means that effectively the impacts of excess northern consumption are offshored to global South nations. And we can see these impacts playing out before our very eyes. Like, deforestation in the Amazon is being done largely for products that are consumed in richer nations. So too with Indonesia, and so forth. So, and this is clear also when it comes to looking at climate breakdown. This image here shows us historical emissions in excess of the planetary boundary of 350 parts per million. What we see is that the USA is responsible for 40% of total excess emissions. The European Union for 29%. The global North as a group, defined as I described, is responsible for no less than 92% of excess emissions historically, and the global South, of course, only about 8%. So, and this is significant because not only is the global North causing climate breakdown, but also the effects are happening in the South. So we know that the global South suffers about 90% of the economic and social costs of climate breakdown, and 98% of deaths related to climate breakdown. Okay, so I think that it's important that we understand this as a manifestation of what we might call atmospheric colonization. It has very clear colonial dimensions to it, in as much as the atmosphere has been colonized by rich nations and the consequences are harming poor nations, in much the same way as the industrialization of the global North depended over the past 500 years on appropriation of resources and labor from the South, with devastating consequences for the South itself during the colonial period, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I think that if we're not paying attention to these, to sort of the colonial dimensions of ecological impacts, then we're largely missing the point. So this is not just about what nations do internally, it's also about the impacts they have abroad. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing here and return to my remarks, if I can. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so we have to ask ourselves, what does all of this mean? We've long been told that nations should aspire to develop towards the Nordic countries, but in an era of ecological breakdown, this clearly no longer makes any sense. If everyone in the world consumed like Scandinavians, we would be exacerbating ecological breakdown in ways that are significantly worse than we're presently seeing. So in other words, the Nordic model is not a universalizable model, and that renders it ineligible, I think, for something that we should aspire to and uphold. Now, of course, Scandinavia is not alone in this. We know that many high-income nations pose just as much of a problem. But as we wake up to the realities of ecological breakdown, it becomes clear that Nordic countries are simply no longer, they simply no longer offer the promise that we once thought they did in terms of what we should pursue. So this means that we need to find ways to effectively update the Nordic model for the Anthropocene. Nordic countries clearly have it right when it comes to public healthcare, education, progressive social democracy, et cetera. But if they are to stand as a beacon for the rest of the world in the 21st century, it's imperative to take quite dramatic steps to bring Nordic economies back into balance with the living world, okay? Now, of course, the main objective here is to scale down resource use, or what we refer to as the material throughput of the economy. Now, achieving sustainability on this front would require a pretty significant reduction of resource extraction and production and consumption in Nordic countries in the region of an aggregate reduction of about 80%. Okay, so getting down to about 1/5 of what's presently used. Now, at first glance, this might seem impossible to achieve. But the good news is that we know it's not only feasible, it can be done without any loss in terms of human well-being or in terms of the social indicators for which the region has become so rightly famous. In fact, we know with empirical data that it can be accomplished while improving human welfare and advancing the cause of social democracy. But ultimately it requires shifting to a different kind of economy altogether, specifically one that is not organized around perpetual GDP growth, okay? Now, the reason I say this is because over the past few years, a strong consensus has emerged among ecological scientists and ecological economists that it's not feasible to achieve significant absolute reductions in embodied resource use while at the same time pursuing economic growth, okay? Yes, we can improve the material efficiency of the economy, and we should strive to do so. But in the context of a growth-oriented system, efficiency improvements do not lead to any absolute reductions in material throughput. They never have in history. And all of our existing empirical models, even under strongly optimistic assumptions, show that they will not in the future, okay? Such gains from efficiency in a growth-oriented system get swamped by the scale effect of growth, and material throughput continues to rise. So there's no empirical evidence that so-called green growth is possible or feasible to achieve, right? And this is not just my opinion. This comes from a wide range of review studies that have been published over the past few years, which we have to take seriously. First and foremost, beginning with a study published by the UN Environment Program. The UN Environment Program used to be a big champion of green growth narratives. They published an extensive model-based study in 2017, showing that there's no feasible level of efficiency improvement that can lead to an absolute decoupling of GDP from material use, okay? So effectively debunking, in the first instance, green growth claims. At the end of 2019, my colleague, the ecological economist Yorgos Kallis, and I published a review paper on this and came to similar conclusions, reviewing not just the UNEP study, but a wide range of other studies. And then more recently, in 2020, a new review of 179 studies on decoupling published since the 1990s finds, and I quote, no evidence of economy-wide, national or international absolute resource decoupling, and no evidence of the kind of decoupling necessary for ecological sustainability. These findings were further reinforced also this year by another meta-analysis looking at all available data on GDP and resource use, which comes to the same conclusion. Okay, so what this means is that in order to achieve our ecological goals, we have to rethink how the economy works altogether. The first step in this direction is to abandon GDP as a measure of progress. It's a heavily flawed indicator in that it counts the monetary value of all the stuff we extract and produce and consume in the commodity economy, but it does not account for the costs of this activity. So for example, if you cut down a forest and sell the timber to IKEA for furniture, GDP goes up, but it does not count the costs of losing that forest as a sink for carbon, as a future resource for human use, or as a habitat for biodiversity, et cetera, okay? In fact, the person who devised the GDP metric in the 1930s, Simon Kuznets, himself was very careful to warn in a statement to Congress, we should never use GDP growth as an objective or a measure of economic health. It's too destructive of a measure, okay? It doesn't count for the social and ecological costs of growth, right? So the question becomes, why do we pursue GDP growth? And the reason, of course, is because we believe it is necessary for improving human welfare. That is the main reason that we give. But in fact, this claim does not hold water. We know that there's no causal relationship between GDP and human well-being, okay? For example, there are many nations that exceed very high levels of human development with very low levels of GDP per capita, okay? Indeed, past a certain point, which high-income nations have long exceeded, even the correlation between these two completely breaks down, right? What actually matters for human well-being is to have access to the resources that are necessary for a healthy, flourishing life, okay? That much is empirically clear. And so if human well-being is our goal, it makes much more sense to target that goal directly rather than growing the GDP indiscriminately, regardless of the costs it might have, and just kind of hoping it will somehow magically trickle down to help us achieve the objectives that we want. Okay. Now, I should reemphasize there's a strong scientific consensus around this approach. A recent paper signed by more than 11,000 scientists argues that high-income nations need to abandon growthist models and shift to post-growth models if we're going to have any chance of preventing ecological breakdown. Okay, so that means shifting towards focusing on human well-being and ecological stability rather than perpetual growth. Last year, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, took a step in this direction by removing GDP growth as an objective for her country's government's budget, right, for the first time. When this was announced, there was an extraordinary explosion of excitement on social media and in traditional media. Clearly, people are aware that growthist economics is a problem and they're eager for a kind of alternative. And the leaders of Iceland and Scotland quickly followed suit, pledging a similar kind of transition. Okay. So right now, the dominant assumption, remarkably, in economics is that all sectors of the economy must grow all the time, regardless of whether or not we actually need them, which is an astonishingly irrational and ecologically incoherent way to run an economy. A much more reasonable approach is to have an open conversation about what sectors of the economy we actually need to grow, things like renewable energy, public transportation, and so on. What sectors are big enough already, and what sectors are too big, and we should actively degrow on the grounds that they are not actually socially necessary to any meaningful conception of human need. Okay, and when we have that conversation, a number of options will arise immediately. Of course, we know that we have to scale down fossil fuels. We know we have to scale down the SUV industry. We know we have to scale down, air travel. Industrial beef production has to decline. The arms industry is obviously socially unnecessary and extremely ecologically destructive. Advertising has a negative impact on well-being and is directly associated with rising excess resource use. Food waste, for example, can be, in high-income nations like in Scandinavia, around 50% of all food in the country is binned, largely because of supermarket practices and advertising schemes and so on. So that, that's a huge sector of the economy that can be scaled down without any loss to human well-being. Planned obsolescence. In a capitalist economy, there's a strong incentive for companies to produce goods that are designed to break down after a short period of time. And so we see lifespans of everything from our technology gadgets to washing machines and refrigerators shrinking dramatically over the past few decades. IKEA, for example, has become a multi-billion-dollar industry business, primarily by innovating furniture that is designed to be discarded, right? It literally produces disposable furniture. So, we can address this kind of problem by introducing mandatory maximum lifespans for products. We can introduce rights to repair to ensure that you can get your technology gadgets repaired without, needing to have proprietary pieces and so on. We can shift from new buildings to retrofit and maintenance of existing buildings. We can shift from private cars to public transportation. In fact, in virtually every way, public forms of consumption are more efficient in terms of resource and energy use than private forms of consumption. Everything from water, public water is more efficient than bottled water, et cetera, et cetera. There are huge parts of the economy that can be actively scaled down without any loss to human well-being and with significant ecological gain. But of course, thinking that way requires first that we abandon this assumption that all sectors must continue to grow all the time, right? Now, crucially, as we scale down socially unnecessary and ecologically destructive parts of the economy, this is likely to lead to an increase in unemployment. Indeed, fears about unemployment are the single biggest reason that governments have thus far avoided this approach. But interestingly, this outcome is very simple to prevent, right? With two straightforward policies. The first is to shorten the working week, okay? So as we get rid of unnecessary labor, then we shorten the working week, ensure that everyone has access to existing necessary labor by distributing labor more fairly, more evenly, right? So you take the gains from this approach in the form of leisure time for workers, right? And the second policy is to introduce a public job guarantee. And this has proven ecological impact. Okay. What a job guarantee effectively allows us to do is a number of things. First of all, it takes the question of employment off the table. In this sense, it is the single most powerful ecological policy that we could possibly introduce. Once the question of employment is off the table, then we can have an open conversation about what sectors of the economy we want to scale down without worrying about the specter of job losses, okay? It just doesn't matter anymore, right? A job guarantee also allows us to mobilize labor for what we actually need in the economy. We know that, as we try to accomplish this transition, it's going to require quite a lot of work. We need to improve public services, we have to build public transportation, which in some countries is going to require significant infrastructural outlay. We have to install renewable energy capacity, retrofit houses, regenerate ecologies and woodlands, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of care work that has to be done in the economy. The private sector is not going to do any of this alone. A public job guarantee allows us to ensure that everyone who wants to work has access to a socially meaningful, ecologically necessary job. And this has high levels of public support in the region of, when it polls, even in the USA and UK, in the region of 70 to 75% public support for a public job guarantee. A job guarantee also gives us a chance to set labor standards in terms of you can set the living wage at whatever you want it to be, and the rest of the private sector has to accommodate that. Otherwise, employees will move from the private sector to the job guarantee. So it forces the private sector to raise its standards to the job guarantee level. You can also use the job guarantee to shorten the working week by saying, these jobs will be at 30 hours a week. The rest of the private sector has to fall in line, otherwise they will lose employees to the job guarantee, okay? So it's a very effective way in a single policy, which is affordable to achieve with about 1% of GDP, this can be done. This also allows us to significantly reduce inequality in the economy. This is important because we know that the rich are disproportionately responsible for excess resource use and energy use. Thomas Piketty himself has pointed out that a reduction of purchasing power for the rich would be the single most impactful ecological policy, right? So what does this look like? It looks like wealth taxes. It looks like maybe a maximum income policy where any income that's in excess of some certain given multiple of the median income would face a 100% tax. Okay, we gotta have a conversation about what that would be. A factor of 10, a factor of 20, a factor of 100. In other words, all of this points to the need for us to significantly reorganize the economy around human needs and ecological stability, rather than around the imperative of perpetual growth. And this requires ultimately evolving beyond the rigid ideological constraints of capitalism and imagining a different kind of economy altogether, an economy that is suited for the 21st century, okay? Now, this transition won't just happen on its own. It requires vision, it requires leadership, it requires courage, it requires political will, and most importantly, it requires democracy, because we know that the more citizens have direct democratic control over economic policy decisions, they tend to opt for ecologically sustainable options, sustaining ecology indefinitely into the future, even when it comes at the cost of immediate financial gain, okay? There's a strong connection between democracy and ecological outcomes. So for me, Nordic countries can, should, and are ideally placed to lead this transition, pointing the way to a more ecological economy for other countries to follow, and thereby renewing the Nordic model for the 21st century. Thank you very much.